Hello, I'm Benjamin, and I'm going to be speaking about deploying machine learning. And as we just heard, this is really where theory meets practice, and it's also where we can really measure impact. And it's important to note that this is not a technical conversation. This is really more, you could say, the philosophy of technology. And I think why that is important is that really impacts how we see cutting-edge technology, how people assess cutting-edge technology, and gives us a sense of how that will be received in the world and how it will be used. So there is a reason for thinking about technology in a broader view. So I'm going to start by speaking a little bit about myself, because I think that this gives a good sense of different ways that machine learning can be deployed. So I have been working with machine learning since 2008. And the machine learning that really interests me the most is focused on prediction. You could say focused on predicting the future. And here, let's go back here a bit. And I think that if you are interested in prediction and interested in machine learning, probably the best place to begin is financial markets, because this is where there is the biggest of big data. It comes at you in real time, 24 hours a day, and sub-millisecond speed. It is truly global. And it's where also the competition is the fiercest, the most unrelenting, and the most creative. And I worked for a quantitative hedge fund, first in Chicago, then in London. And my job, in a sense, was very clearly defined. Very, very different than my job today, and I imagine the jobs of many people here. My job was to predict patterns in data faster and more accurately than our competitors. And I led teams that traded markets 24 hours a day, and I led teams that built autonomous agents that traded on signal in markets, signal that either human traders couldn't understand or didn't see. And we're going to speak a little bit more about deploying machine learning. This is the focus of our conversation today. So I want to start out by saying, when I worked at this hedge fund, there were no problems deploying machine learning because we had no customers. So all of the capital that we traded with belonged to two people. So if we came up with an interesting model that was faster or better than what we had, we put it into practice. And we could see very, very, very quickly whether we were right or wrong and to what degree. And that is exceedingly different than what I experience today as the CEO of a startup. So I founded Macrorize with two other people, a chief design officer and a chief AI officer. And the chief design officer is Sebastian Kaupert. The chief AI officer is Suvrit Sra. And Suvrit is a world-renowned expert in large-scale machine learning and optimization. I keep skipping forward here. And we built Macrorize to bring machine learning to healthcare. And we've spent the last several years refining and deploying core AI. And what came out of that was an understanding of how large healthcare organizations think and how healthcare as a business operates. And I think most importantly for our conversation today, how large organizations think about innovation and think about disruptive, cutting-edge technology. And we've also worked, in fact, with some small organizations. But I found that to be similar across the board. So I'm going to say something very controversial here, and I think particularly in the scope of this event, and that is that the enterprise has not embraced machine learning. And we've been hearing really over the last couple of days about all the ways that organizations are using machine learning. What I have seen is that there is a lot of misunderstanding, concern. We have worked with some of the most sophisticated organizations in the world. We've worked with organizations that are not sophisticated at all. And all of them somewhat interact with machine learning in the same way. And we'll get to why that is. And I think it's also a really important point to recognize that we're in Montreal, and sort of the forefathers of AI in this city fled from the United States, let's say 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, they were working on cars that drove themselves. They were working on deep learning. They were working on many of the technologies that we see around us today that are considered to be cutting edge. So the core technology has been around for a long time. And I think that makes it even more important to ask, why do we not see it more? Why is it not more pervasive? And I would argue that it comes down to a couple points. And in fact, even these several points really all boil down to the same thing, which is transparency. Particularly with deep learning, it is inherently unintelligible. And when you are at the enterprise perspective, it is very hard to differentiate between algorithm A and algorithm B and company C. How do I know that their solution is the best fit for my problem? And how do I know that it works? It's very confusing. And we're going to talk not much at all about data security, but I would even say that comes down to the same question of explainability. And we could sort of go one step further and say all of this has to do with transparency. So we're going to speak a bit about storytelling. So I wanted to start off with a building that I really love. And probably most of you all don't think of buildings when we're talking about storytelling. But this is the Centre Pompidou, and it's a building that sits in the center of Paris. And it was unveiled in 1977. It was designed by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers. And when it was presented to the public, much of the French media called it a monster. And it is still today a controversial, a radical building. And what makes it so radical is that it has essentially taken the guts of a building and pulled it out and put it on the outside. So the pipes that carry waste, air, water, all of those, rather than being tucked discreetly behind a wall, are now visible for everybody to see. The escalator is on the exterior. You can see how people interact with the museum. You could potentially call this structure a machine for interacting with culture. And it is a machine that explains itself. And from what I have seen, I think that this is likely the most effective version of an explainable algorithm. And I think, appropriately enough, if any of you have stepped inside a modern data center, you will see much the same approach. So inside data centers, they have taken, very often, the innards, again, the pipes that bring water, air, that cool, and they've revealed them, and they've color-coded them. Again, the notion of a structure that explains itself. And why that is important is it helps to tell a complex story. A building is complicated. A museum is complicated. This is a case where it reveals its inner logic. So why is it important to have that explainability front and center? It's important because no matter who you present to within the enterprise, within an organization, they are going to have to go and take that story that you tell them and tell others. And it doesn't matter where they sit. If they run the whole organization, if they're the CEO, they report to shareholders, they report to a board of directors. Anybody within an enterprise has to sell what you are selling to them. And so they need a clear and simple story. And to dig a little bit deeper here, I would say the reason why they need a clear and simple story is that inherently, machine learning is terrifying. And it's not terrifying in the sense of robots that are going to come and eat us up. It's terrifying because it is inherently destabilizing. The notion of a system that learns in real time is that it responds to shifts on the ground. And many large organizations strive inherently for stability. So if we implement a system which is responsive to customers or the population or reality, that means things are going to be changing all the time. And that's very, very frightening from just a very basic level. But if any of you have dealt with large organizations, you know this is very important. How do you budget for that? If the budget is going to shift quite a bit because reality is going to shift, and you have a system that is shifting along with that, that makes everything complex. And so I think that's sort of my own diagnosis of why the need for a simple story is even more important, because there is a core anxiety there. So part 2 of why is a simple story important? Because metrics in machine learning are hard to describe and hard to understand. And just to sort of foreground the fact that there really aren't an established set of metrics that everybody agrees on within the machine learning community that are clear to a non-technical consumer. And I believe that this problem of metrics, and we're talking again about performance, how do we know this works, ultimately has a problem of what I'm calling here the coastline paradox. And the coastline paradox comes from science, and it suggests that a fact, which is we cannot accurately measure a coastline, because depending upon our perspective, certain features are visible, others are not. Each one of those features has a different length. So if you imagine you're in an airplane and you're looking down at a body of water and you see a coastline, that coastline appears to have a certain length because some features are hidden from you. As you zoom in and you bring your nose to a millimeter from the water, a whole nother set of features appear. Each one of those features has a specific length. When added to other features, means that that coastline has a different length than you believed before. So what I am trying to say here is that depending upon your vantage point on what you are measuring, and this is fundamental to physics as well, you are going to get a different measurement. And this is particularly true when we are bringing machine learning solutions to worthwhile problems. They're complex. The way by which we measure that performance can be difficult to describe. And again, I'm presenting to you all some formidable challenges. You have to come up with a way to tell that story in as simple a way as possible. So I'm going to give you an example of the difficulty of that, and in a sense try to confuse you with our own product. And this is a product called Sybil, and it's software for it's software for intelligent patient scheduling. And we typically begin an engagement by predicting outcomes from data that has been scrubbed of an outcome. So we don't know what's happened, and we predict to the customer, this is what happened to your patients. So we have false negatives, false positives, true positives, and false positives. That already is pretty confusing. Then you get to the fact that a patient not showing up and a patient canceling an appointment results in the same thing for a healthcare organization. It results in a gap in the schedule, a loss of revenue, and restricting access to care for patients who have been waiting weeks or months to see a doctor. But those are different outcomes. So if we incorporate sensitivity to the difference between a cancellation and a no-show, now we have 9 categories of classification with which we have to report accuracy, and precision. And that's very, very confusing. And what a customer really wants to know is, how often are you right? How often are you wrong? And how does that impact your solution? And so we have this sort of fundamental problem. How do we squeeze 9 categories of ambiguity into something binary? So I'm going to quickly here talk about what I call the last mile of the last mile problem, which is taking that machine learning and operationalizing it. So we're going to all assume here that we've gotten through those various gates. We've figured out a way to tell the story, tell the value proposition clearly and simply, and now we've brought machine learning to the enterprise, to a large hospital, to a government agency. And the reason why this is so important is that any enterprise does not lack from insight or information. In the most pessimistic view of machine learning, you are bringing another piece of paper to a desk that is already piled high with paper. And it is our responsibility to not just bring more insight, but to actually solve a problem. And that's that last gap, if I'm being clear here. And I think that I cannot overemphasize the importance of that, given the incredible vision or dream of AI that all of us have been hearing about. And if that results in just more insight in front of someone who already has too much insight, then we haven't fulfilled that promise. And I want to, as an example of that, talk about a fairly common problem in healthcare and a question that has been brought up very often. So we, as a company, Macrolize, we've been asked to predict many, many things by many different types of organizations. And very often, those organizations don't have a view of how they would change their product or their reality if they could see into the future. And what I would argue is that first, they need to think about how will we change what we're doing if we could predict the future, and then try to predict the future. And I think a clear example of this is this question of predicting mortality, which comes up very often in healthcare. In the United States, the vast majority of the total cost of care over an individual's life is in the last weeks of life. And very often, that is spent in an intensive care unit. And we have been asked by hospitals to predict the mortality of people who come into an ICU. And I want us all to sort of pause and think about, if we could imagine a technology which could perfectly assess somebody's probability of expiring, in the language of healthcare, and we could say, OK, there is a 63.2453% chance of that occurring, and you are the medical director of an intensive care unit, what are you going to do with that information? How are you going to change the delivery of care? And of course, we are now wading into very, very complex, very difficult problems. And I hope that that gives us a sense of why this last bit, turning the insight into something which solves a problem directly, is so difficult. So I very quickly want to conclude with a hero of mine, Daniel Kahneman. So trained as a psychologist, the first non-economist to receive the Nobel Prize in economics. And why you should look to his work is because he is one of the most clear thinkers that I have ever experienced on the incredible frailty of the human mind. He gives us such a clear map of how human decision-making falls apart. And everybody in this room who is building a product or building a solution or building a company, what you will present will be misunderstood over and over and over again. And even sometimes people will be interested in it even though they do misunderstand it. And the reason why we should look to Daniel Kahneman is he gives us a sense of how to navigate that. And I think why that is important in the context of this conversation is that deploying machine learning is not a technology problem. It is a human problem. Really what it is about is, as we discussed, storytelling and presenting something in clear enough terms to other people so that they can carry it away with them. And with that, I will conclude. And hopefully, do we have any time for questions? No. OK.